Well, welcome to your 27th book of the Old Testament. We're going to be in the book of Daniel, significant book for a number of reasons. One of my teachers called this book the key to prophecy. And you'll see as you go through the book and as we go through it, we'll see why. I'll be just going over the first two chapters today. Chapter 2 is a little lengthy, so you only have two chapters in your reading for today. The first chapter of Daniel I call Daniel's personal history, and then the second chapter is about Nebuchadnezzars' dream. So we'll see as we develop here that in the book of Daniel what the Lord is doing is he is two things. One is pulling back the curtain to see the spiritual realities behind the political realities that we see on the earth. So we're not going to see exactly, for example, where the United States fits in. I'll actually be preaching on that if you're in town and you're in Estes Park. I'll be preaching about the sovereignty of God in the United States at the First Baptist Church of Estes Park on the 11th of October. So if you'd like to learn more about that, certainly love to see you there. You can contact me. But one thing we're going to see here is that God pulls back the curtain of history to see, or the curtain so we can see beyond history, behind it, and see God's sovereignty at work. So we see God's, this plan of history and God's sovereignty at the same time in the book of Daniel. But let's get into it. Chapter 1, again, I've labeled that Daniel's personal history. And we see in the first 7 chapters or so, or 7 verses, is Daniel's deportation. Daniel is taken by Nebuchadnezzar during the reign of Jehoiakim. Should be a familiar name. You've heard that in 2 Kings as well as 2 Chronicles. Give you some references here. 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 24 to chapter 24, verse 7 talks about Jehoiakim's reign and that deportation that occurred in 605. And it's also discussed briefly in 2 Chronicles 36, 5 through 8. So that's kind of the historical background for this first chapter. As Daniel is taken into deportation by Nebuchadnezzar. And when he arrives in verse 8, Daniel resolves in his mind to not defile himself. That is, he's going to be dedicated to purity. So the first 7 verses are about his deportation. Then verses 7 to 10, let's say 8 to 10, are about his dedication to purity. And whenever you make such a dedication of yourself to the Lord, again, we say dedication to purity, but to set yourself apart for Him, for holiness, you're going to be challenged right away. And that's what we see in these verses here, is that Daniel not only is dedicated to purity, but he's immediately challenged. And Daniel responds by putting together a definite plan. Again, brothers and sisters, we can learn a lot from Daniel here, that when we choose to set ourselves apart, when we choose to dedicate ourselves to the Lord, in other words, to be holy in our lives, challenges will come to us, and we need to respond to those challenges not by throwing up our hands in despair, but rather to make a definite plan to set yourself apart for the Lord, whether it's your whole life or just part of your life, to set yourself a plan to do that, to think it through. And in verses 15 and 16, continuing in this area of Daniel's dedication to purity, we see his victory, that God led him and sustained him. And God will do the same to you as He does for Daniel, to honor His desire to be holy. He'll honor your desire to be holy. He'll honor your plans to be holy by giving you triumph and victory in your life. We see then starting in verse 17, in this continuing personal history of Daniel, his reputation for wisdom. And that goes through the end of the book. We also see the length of Daniel's ministry in Babylon to the first year of King Cyrus. So Daniel's prophetic ministry goes from the exile of 605. Sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. Went from the exile of 605 to the willingness or the dedication and the declaration from Cyrus to allow them to return in about 538 BC, so quite a long time. So chapter 1 is about Daniel's personal history. Chapter 2 then is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Very interesting and key chapter. It's going to be recapitulated a few times in this book. The first few verses here, verses 1 through 6, give you a date. We could call this 602 BC, so this is a few years after the exile that Daniel was taken in. And Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it's very interesting. He conceals the dream. So he must not trust his astrologers, his soothsayers, his holy men. He must have some reason to test them, I guess, because in verses 7 through 12, we see that he conceals the dream. He says, find me a man who can tell me not only its interpretation, but also the dream itself. And this is going to be proof to Nebuchadnezzar that whoever comes up with the dream and its interpretation is actually accurate, could be relied upon. Verse 14 then, down to verse 23, we see the dream is revealed to Daniel. So Daniel receives this dream and ends up actually saving the lives of all the astrologers and holy men and soothsayers in Babylon. So he develops quite the reputation here among those men. But he, starting in verse 24, he recites and interprets the dream, and that fills most of the rest of the chapter. So in verses 32, so there's a introduction here. This is a vision for the latter days, it says in verse 28, and we've seen that in the prophets enough to know we're talking about this is a vision that has to do with the last days of human history, the end times as we call them today. Verse 32 down to 35, Daniel recites the dream. So he first tells Nebuchadnezzar what his dream is. And again, the reason that this is working like this is Nebuchadnezzar needs proof. He wants proof that this prophet or whoever is going to interpret his dream can be believed. And the way to be believed is by first telling him what the dream was. Then we begin the interpretation in verses 37 down to, let's see, about 45 would be the interpretation of the dream. And I'll summarize it here. I've got a little summary sheet that I put together. He sees multiple kingdoms, 5 altogether. He sees a head of gold, which the interpretation says is actually him. It's Nebuchadnezzar. It's the Babylonian Empire, which goes to about 539. Remember I told you in 538 about Cyrus issues his decree. That's where the Babylonian Empire ends and the Medes and Persian Empire begins, which is the chest and arms of silver. So Nebuchadnezzar and what he represents, the Babylonian Empire, is that head of gold. The chest and arms of silver are the next kingdom that comes, which is the Medo-Persian Empire, and it lasted from about 539 to 331 BC. The next one then that came after the Medo-Persian Empire, the third worldwide empire, was that of Greece. This is the belly and thighs of bronze. This is Alexander the Great, a fellow Macedonian. That's where my grandfather claimed to be from, even though he had immigrated to Croatia, but he claimed to be Macedonian. So Alexander the Great was from Macedonia. He attacked the Media-Persian Empire in 334, completed its defeat by 331. And his empire lasted quite a long time until it was absorbed into the Roman Empire in about 63 BC. And that is the fourth kingdom that he sees here, that is pictured as feet of clay and iron. So as you go through the interpretation, he says several times, this is a kingdom, this is a kingdom, this is a kingdom. So it's described several times as one who breaks and crushes and smashes. And this is Iron Kingdom of Rome. Eventually becomes hollowed out, regresses, becomes a weakened and divided kingdom, and that's the toes refer to that 10 divisions. And we'll see in other passages as well. It's explained more fully. And then finally, we have this large stone where comes out of heaven, not cut from human hands, comes and crushes what's remaining of this Roman Empire, these 10 toes of the Roman Empire. This is the final kingdom. This is the last kingdom. It says in verse 44, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. So this final fifth kingdom is the last. So what Nebuchadnezzar sees in his dream is a panorama of human history. That all of history, including the time that we live in today, is covered somehow in this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. So, verse 46, Nebuchadnezzar receives this dream and falls on his face, pays homage to Daniel, and honors God. Truly your God, he says, is a God of God and Lords of lords and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. So he's sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that what Daniel told him is true, and that Daniel's God, the God of heaven, can be relied upon. It's very important. If you go back to verse 37, Daniel replies to Nebuchadnezzar, who is the most powerful man on earth right now. He says, you, O king, the king of kings, that is, you're above all kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom. So he's telling Nebuchadnezzar, there is a God who is more powerful than you, who controls all of human history, who has given you your kingdom, and, oh, by the way, these other 5 kingdoms, he's determined this as well. Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that, falls on his face, and does homage. So Daniel made a request of the king, it says, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. Important to recognize that Daniel is a prophet who is speaking to the king of Babylon. Remember, Ezekiel was speaking to the people, the Jewish people in Babylon. So this is kind of a full court prophetic press that God is having in Babylon during this time. So that's your reading for today. Tomorrow we'll move into chapters 3 and 4 of Daniel. So important book. It's a great book. We can learn a lot from Daniel, his dedication, his plan to honor God, his unwillingness to compromise, and speaking truth to power is a important thing, and that's what Daniel does. So enjoy this book. This is an important book. It's going to play a significant role as we move into the New Testament as well. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy your reading in the book of Daniel.